Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Building Subtxt. Today, I want to talk about the Best Picture nominees for 2024 and to show why, from a narrative perspective, why pretty much all of them were nominated in the first place is because they had complete stories. And I just want to show in subtext what that means when you have a complete story and why you even go through all the trouble of setting all this up. So these are the Best Picture nominees for 2024. We got the Holdovers, Oppenheimer, Maestro, American Fiction, Poor Things, Killers of the Flower Moon, Zone of Interest, Past Lives, Barbie, Anatomy of a Fall. All of these, except for two, have complete stories. Can you guess which two don't have complete stories? There's one that was completely shut out, which was Maestro. It didn't have a complete story. And the other one, Zone of Interest, is a phenomenal film, but it won Best Sound Design, not Best Screenplay. All the other ones have complete stories, meaning they all have dramatic arguments that are at the core of what it was that they were about. And that's why they got nominated for Best Picture, because there's something more there than just what you see on screen. So let's look at all of them. So I'm here in subtext and I will go down to the Storyforms. And this is where you can see, well, these are all the Storyforms over the past 30 years with the most recent ones up here at the top. So let's look at Killers of the Flower Moon, which I hadn't realized that I had not published yet. So we'll open this up and I'm just going to come down here to the dramatic argument, which is the core argument between the main character point of view and the obstacle character point of view. Now, these are point of views, so they can be handed off from one player to another player, even if they're on completely opposite sides of who's good guy and who is bad guy, which is totally what's happening here in Killers of the Flower Moon. We have Ernest here on the left, Leo DiCaprio, who is constantly working outside of tolerances. He's like above and beyond how people should behave, how they should perform in life, because he's a hitman for Hale, right? And then on the other side, so the other side of the coin from deviation is accurate. So if deviation is all about everything that's outside of the envelope, accurate is about everything within the envelope. And what I loved about this is a way to illustrate accuracy, a motivation of being accurate, is tolerating conditions or tolerating harsh conditions. So here you can see it probably more clearly in Molly because she's putting up with a lot. She's tolerating what her husband is doing, deluding herself. And then on the other side of that, you have somebody else who's also deluding himself, tolerating the harsh conditions in order to become rich and successful. So both of them are inserting into the narrative this idea of accuracy as motivation. And on the other side of that is deviation. These are two sides of the same coin. That's why the story works as well as it does, beyond just the phenomenal acting and directing, everything else that's going on there. This is at the core of the argument in the story, and is why, because he never really grows out of this, why it ends up in failure at the end, in tragedy. So again, complete, solid story form. Knowing these two are at the core of it, then you have this entire story form at the bottom, which makes that argument in there. And essentially says, if you stay on that path, then it's going to end up in tragedy for everybody, which it does. Complete story. Works great. All right, so that's Killers of the Flower Moon. Then we go down to Anatomy of a Fall, which actually won Best Screenplay. And it also has a complete story. Now, this one's great because if you've seen the film, it's hard to tell whether or not she was really guilty or not. They do a great job of leaving that out. And the reason why has partly to do with this argument. So this argument is the argument between perception and actuality. So the argument between what we see or how we see things and the argument for seeing the true state of things, the true nature of it. And here the argument is carried out between Sandra, the mom, and then her son, Daniel, who's blind, who is coming from that point of view of actuality. And that argument goes back and forth to where at the end of the narrative, which is essentially trying to figure out whether or not she was guilty, she never gets off of that. She stays within that perception, again, like Leo DiCaprio in Killers of the Flower Moon. It ends up in success, but it's not the greatest thing in the world for her. She's still unresolved there at the end. And what's great is when you look at this argument between the two of them here, which is perception and actuality, then if you come down here and you look at what is driving her, it's chaos. So chaos meaning completely random lawlessness. Could be that she actually did it, or she's just really good at managing chaos because of all the stuff that she has to put up with in terms of her husband and all that stuff. But that's why it's so phenomenal, because you never really get to put all the pieces together. You don't get to see what the real true order of it was, and it's all left open to interpretation. So I think that's the reason why this won Best Screenplay, is because it's an amazing illustration of the story form, and in such a way that it leaves it up to interpretation what this chaos actually means. So that is Anatomy of a Fall. So let's go back to the next one. Poor Things. Poor Things is insane. Totally crazy. There's a really good, strong reason why it's so crazy and so different than all the others. And that has a lot to do with not that there's 4 different obstacle characters who are all essentially arguing the same point of view about control. So her dad has control over her. Duncan wants to have control over her. Harry's basically saying you can't have control over everything. And Alfie, he does his best to control her. Whereas she is just a completely free spirit. So again, those two sides of the same point. If you're going to be controlling something, then you actually have to look at freedom or free, people who are motivated towards being free. And again, same sort of narrative. I'm just realizing these are all the same sort of thing, where it's a steadfast. So she's on the right path. She keeps going and eventually pulls the other side, the other obstacle characters, one way or another, to becoming completely irrational with how they deal with things. And it turns out successful and good for her personally. The reason why it's so frenetic and why it might be really difficult for some people to get attached to has to do with this concept here, which is signifying that not that the main character is female, but that the boot record or the underlying operating system of the narrative is geared towards female mental sex, which essentially means looking towards inequities, focusing on justifications, and the balance and imbalance between relationships. So that is one reason why it's a little difficult to get into. But again, has that same two sides of the same coin. Really strong argument from the main character, really strong argument from the obstacle characters. Now remember, this is just a perspective, so you can hand it off from player to player. Doesn't always have to be the same person from beginning to end. They're essentially arguing the same point of view, inserting themselves into the conflict. And obviously she's always arguing her point of view. And that's how you can hand it off from one character to the next. All right, so we have Poor Things. And then let's see what else. American Fiction. I loved American Fiction. So this one's really fun in that it's a little simpler, a little more contained than the other ones. But this argument is great. So this one is an argument between reduction and production. So if on the one side, Monk is completely obsessed with how he's been reduced to just a stereotype, and then that's where all the comedy comes from, because he's trying to show how ridiculous it is. On the other side of that, if you're going to be focusing on how things are reduced down to common denominators, on the other side, you would want people who make the most out of their potential. So Cliff, his brother, is the greatest example of this, because he's found himself later in life and he's just going crazy. He's just massively creative in his own ways and just going to town with production. And that has a significant impact on Monk here. And then, of course, there's one part where he hands it off to Sintara, who's the author that he's trying to make fun of, when she just nails him when they're having lunch. And she basically comes back at him essentially saying, hey, production is what you should be focused on. Whereas he's always thinking about how things are brought down, reduce those lower common denominators. This one is our first example of a film that has a changed main character. So he grows out of that reduction into that sequence at the end where he's making up really crazier and crazier ideas of how he's going to end his life or end his story. That is somebody who has moved out of reduction and the world is just so small, to somebody who's now making a bigger deal out of things and making a big production out of everything. And that brings him success and resolves a lot of the internal angst that he had. So this was really great up here to showcase the growth of the main character from one side to the other side. So that's American Fiction. And then let's see what's next. Next up is Oppenheimer. All right. Oppenheimer is 3 hours. It is similarly set to Anatomy of a Fall in that it is what's known as a memory play. So in other words, the plot of the narrative is all about digging into people's memories and seeing what evidence there is, who was aware of things, who wasn't aware of things, that kind of stuff. So in this film, the argument, which is funny because almost all of Christopher Nolan's films are always about an argument between awareness and self-awareness. This is Inception. This is Memento. So on the one side, you have an awareness as being sensitive to everything that's going on around you. Can you hear the music? So he's aware of everything that's going on outside of him. And then these other three are people who are retreating into themselves or constantly examining themselves. Definitely Lewis Strauss. Like his whole thing is, oh, how's this make me look? How's this make me look? Like he's so concerned with himself. And Jean Tatlock, and then Kitty for sure. Kitty's probably the stronger one. She's also very self-aware, very self-conscientious, and knows her role to play and what's going on in here. So she's constantly in that spot. And those are two sides of the same coin in Oppenheimer. So not only is it wonderfully shot and put together and all that stuff, but that argument is going on between awareness and self-awareness. And again, as with American Fiction, he grows out of that. So he grows out of just completely being obsessed with being aware of everything that's going on in physics, and then moving into a more self-aware, more introspective kind of, oh my gosh, what have I done at the end? I believe I did all this awful stuff. And again, here, total Christopher Nolan ending. They successfully go through the entire history of what happened, but he's in a much worse place at the end of it. So that is Oppenheimer. And let's see what else we got next. So you can see all of these films have a similar narrative construct, but their focus in terms of conflict is geared into different areas. So the next one, okay, Past Lives. Now, Past Lives is also a female mental sex narrative. It's definitely a lot quieter than Poor Things. And here you can see it's the same argument that was being covered in Anatomy of a Fall, but now the sides have switched. So she's seeing things as they really truly are. And the idea that her past life and where she has come from, she's always confronting the reality of that situation. Whereas on the other side, the two men in her life that are challenging her to maintain that reality perspective. And essentially, this is the way things really are. It's not a perception thing that she's doing. This is actually how things are. Whereas the other outside influencers are like, no, this is just your perception. These are just how you're seeing things and how you can be lured into that. And maybe that's not really how things appear to be. So you can see I'm having trouble describing it because it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more subtle in how it's illustrated. It's not like Poor Things, where it's in your face. She's completely free and the other guys are all controlling. This one is more gentle in that this is how things actually are, not how she sees things, how things actually are. And the other two are like, this is just your perception. I'm not really sure if that's really how things are. Again, like the first couple of films, she remains steadfast to that actuality and doesn't grow out of that. And that's why it's a failure for her at the end and a huge tragedy at the end. Just getting to the place where you know these things that are happening, but yet you don't get to the place where you're completely uncertain about it all. You can see the patterns that are in it. So again, you can see this is the flip of Anatomy of a Fall, but much gentler, in that she's driven by seeing the patterns, seeing, oh, this happened before. I can see everything, put it all together. This is the situation that I'm in. Never truly switches over to chaos, because that would have been really quite strange. And then the obstacle characters grow from knowing and not knowing their place in the world or who they are to growing to a place where, all right, you know what? Maybe I got to think about this. Maybe it's okay for us to think about this. So when the main character remains steadfast, the way complete narrative works is the other side changes direction. It has this complete narrative. So this is, I don't know, the fifth or sixth one that I've gone through. Because it has this construct still, that is why it is up there, Best Picture, with all of the other ones. Because it still has this conceit of how all the different through lines are related to each other, and this argument that it's making, which is essentially like, if you maintain this belief in how things really are, then it's going to end up in tragedy for you based on all the decisions you make. So it's a beautiful film, and it's fun to see how, typically speaking, these kind of films, female mental sex films, don't usually get a ton of awards. So it's nice to see that kind of moving up, and to have two very different versions of that in Poor Things and Past Lives. All right. So that's those two films. Saltburn. Okay, no, that was okay. Isn't the Holdovers? Yeah, the Holdovers. Right. So the Holdovers, much simpler narrative to go through compared to the other ones. This is comparatively, this is male mental sex, so it's a lot simpler, which is the dramatic argument between conscience and temptation. Paul Giamatti's character, very much, hey, I'm doing this for the good of you. For everybody else in here, this is how things are, because I don't want you to screw up your life the way that he screwed up his life. And so he's always thinking of the consequences and acting on his morality from that point of view. And then Angus is somebody who is given more towards indulgence, and is somebody who would indulge the immediacy of getting to do what he wanted to do without really thinking of those consequences. So when you bring up conscience, you automatically bring up temptation. You have one character argue one side of it, the other character argue the other side. And in the case of the Holdovers, you have a changed main character who switches from conscience to temptation. So by the end of the film, he's drinking in the car, driving out. He's off to do his own thing. Successful in terms of the fact that the kid got to stay in school. Everybody grew. They matured. There was a lot of maturity in the story. That's the goal of the story, is to grow into, become something different than you were at the beginning, the narrative. He's not necessarily resolved, which kind of is why that bittersweet feeling at the end of the Holdovers. But very simple story, just moving straight from conscience to temptation. When you set those two and you have him have this fixed mindset, then of course has got all kinds of issues with denial, like denying himself happiness. Any point of any part of his life is his main character's personal issue. So that's how those two work together. And then I think we're getting close to the end, which is Barbie. All right. So Barbie, you'll notice it's here twice. This is not a mistake. Okay, so Barbie, two writers, two writer-directors, two story forms in the same story, which is why it's so big and why it probably is less cartoony than it probably could have been. You have the Noah Baumbach version of the story, which pits Barbie against Ken and is an argument between meeting other people's expectations, which is the more obvious thing. I'm Barbie, everybody expects me to be this way. And then Ken, who is coming from the point of view of determination, like, hey, I'm a man, I get to decide what I do. I'm just Ken, you get to determine yourself. So those are those two sides of that argument, which seems to be the more obvious argument between expectation and determination. So in the Noah Baumbach version, it's a little more obvious what you would expect. And that's because male mental sex is very clear. It's very much there's a problem, which is that she is expected to act a certain way. At the end, it's solved when she determines for herself what kind of life she wants to lead. And that is changed, and then success bit. So this has nothing to do with gender. It's usually frequently the mental sex of the author. This is Noah Baumbach's part of the story, I would assume. And then for the other story form, we have this one, which is likely the Greta Gerwig side of things, which is the argument between Barbie and Gloria. So you can have more than one story form in a single work. Lots of films do this. Usually films that are much more epic in style would have two different story forms going on. I think it's interesting because you have essentially two writer-directors who are very strong writers on their own. One did the male mental sex version, and then this one is the female mental sex version, where it's not an argument between the expectations and the determinations. It's more an argument between the unending torment of having to live up to standards of beauty, of perfection. Almost sounds like expectation, but isn't quite the same thing. This one is not so much about meeting those expectations because of the results that'll come out of it, but more so the fact that it's just unending. I'm just constantly in torment. So that's the funny part in the beginning, which is everybody think about, how you're going to die, or like it's just every day is the same day. That is that argument of unending, where on the other side, you have Glory, who's cut everything off. Everything comes to an end. It's over. It's done. So when you bring up unending torment, then cutting things off at the end is the other balancing side of that. And you can see it's less of a black and white argument that you would find in the male mental sex story form. This one is more nuanced, a little more subtle. The change isn't so much that she goes from being in unending torment to finally ending things, although there is that sense that's the new direction that she is headed in, as opposed to being caught up in all this unending torment. Now I'm headed off in this direction. There's still some leftover stuff to deal with, but now I'm headed down a different path. And that's the difference between male mental sex stories and female mental sex stories. So it's just really interesting in that you have these two really clear arguments going on with two sets of main characters and obstacle characters. Same main character in each story form, just the arguments being played out with two different sets. And that's why it feels like there's two different stories going on at once, and it has a couple different endings at the end. That's one story form finishing, and then you still have the other story form, and then that ends. And that's what happens in Barbie. I think that might be it. Are we done with this? I think that's it. Make sure I got them all. Holdovers, Oppenheimer, American Fiction, Poor Things, Killers of the Flower, Past Lives, Barbie, and Edward Fall. That's it. If you want to know why these films were nominated for Best Picture, it's because all of them, except for Maestro, which some people might say is Oscar bait, because it's almost like it has to be there for some reason. I don't remember there being a story form. The fact that it was completely shut out tells me it wasn't. And Zone of Interest is an amazing experience, but I'm not sure what argument is being made there. Maybe some of the messaging that's come out afterwards might reflect that some people aren't able to communicate as effectively as these other films. They have this really grand structure behind them, some kind of bigger argument that's going on. Barbie has two different arguments that are going on, similar, but two different complete ones. And it's no coincidence that Anatomy of a Fall, which was up for Best Picture, also won for Best Screenplay because it had that complete story form at the center of it all, and an argument between a main character and an obstacle character who are really just two sides of the same coin, looking at the same thing from two different perspectives that both are right and both are wrong. And in that dynamic inability for the two to resolve themselves, you get a story. So that's it for Building Subtext and the Best Picture nominees for 2024. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Otherwise, I will see you next time.